My wife had been gone for almost 2 years when the call came that my brother was dying. I drove 11 hours straight from Tucson to a hospice in Boise, the kind of place that smells like lavender trying to cover something else. The nurse at the front desk gave me a look I couldn't read and said my brother had been asking for me. In the room across from his, a woman in a wheelchair with a quilt over her knees watched me walk past. She didn't say anything that first day, but on my 4th night there, when I came out of my brother's room at 2 in the morning to get coffee from the machine down the hall, she was sitting in the doorway of her room in the dark. She looked at me like she'd been waiting, and she said, real soft, almost like she was afraid someone would hear, "Whatever your nephew tells you when he gets here, don't believe a word of it. Drive home tonight if you can. I want to tell you my name is Owen Hartwich. I'm 63 years old. I worked 38 years as a freight dispatcher for a regional trucking outfit before I retired 3 summers ago, and I never thought of myself as a man who could be fooled. I balance my checkbook every Sunday morning. I read the fine print. My wife Marlo used to laugh at me because I'd spend 20 minutes at the gas pump deciding whether the car wash was worth the extra $4. I tell you all this so you understand. The man I'm about to describe, the one who walked into that hospice the next afternoon, believing the woman across the hall was just confused or medicated, the one who hugged his nephew and didn't think twice, that man trusted everyone he loved, and he almost lost everything because of it. Before I go any further, I want to thank you for being here. If you'd take a second and tell me down below in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, I'd appreciate it. I read everyone. I'm just going to say up front that some details of the story have been changed for storytelling, but the heart of it, the lesson of it, that's as real as the floorboards under my feet right now. My brother's name was Hollis. He was 4 years older than me, and he'd raised me more than our father ever did. When our dad walked out in the spring of 1968, Hollis was 12 and I was 8, and from that day forward, he was the one who taught me how to throw a curveball, how to shave, how to apologize to a girl. He was the steadiest man I ever knew. So when his daughter-in-law called me in late October and told me he'd been moved into hospice care, I didn't even pack a proper bag. I threw 3 shirts and a toothbrush in a duffel and got in the truck. Hollis had pancreatic cancer. By the time I got there, he was down to maybe 90 pounds, and his hands shook when he tried to hold the cup of ice chips the nurse brought in. But his mind was sharp, and the first thing he did when I walked in was grab my wrist and pull me close and say, "Where's the boy? Where's Cale? You see him yet?" Cale is my nephew, Hollis's only son. 41 years old, lived up in Spokane, worked in commercial insurance or something close to it. I told my brother no, I hadn't seen Cale yet, that the nurse said he'd be down in the morning. And Hollis nodded, but he didn't look relieved. He looked tired, the kind of tired that goes past the body. I sat with him 3 days before that woman across the hall said anything to me. Her name, I'd learned later from a nurse, was Mrs. Pemberley. Late 70s, maybe 80. Stage 4 something, I never asked. She had a daughter who'd come once, on a Sunday afternoon with a paper bag of clean nightgowns, and left after 20 minutes. Other than that, no visitors. I'd see her sometimes in the common room when I went to stretch my legs, sitting by the window doing a crossword in pen. I felt sorry for her, the way you feel sorry for anyone alone at the end of something. The first afternoon I walked past her room, I said hello, and she nodded at me but didn't speak. The second day I brought her one of the muffins from the family kitchen the volunteers stocked, and she took it and said, "Thank you, very polite." And that was it. It was the 3rd night that something shifted. I'd been sitting beside Hollis for hours, holding his hand while he slept, listening to the rattle of the oxygen concentrator and the wind outside the window. Around midnight, I stepped out to walk the hallway and clear my head, and as I passed Mrs. Slett Pemberley's room, I saw she was awake, sitting up in her chair, the lamp on low. She looked at me and said, "Your brother's dying." Not unkindly, just stating it. I stopped and said, "Yes, ma'am, he is." And she said, "He's worried about something. He's been talking in his sleep. The nurses come and go, and they don't listen, but I can hear through the wall." I didn't think much of it then. People talk in their sleep, especially on morphine. I told her thank you for keeping him company in her own way, and I went back into my brother's room. But the next night was when she really spoke. It was past 2 in the morning. I was wrung out. Hadn't slept more than 3 hours in a stretch since I got there. I'd just come out of Hollis's room because the night nurse needed to change his line, and I was walking down to the coffee machine when I saw Mrs. Pemberley's door was open, and she was sitting in her wheelchair right in the doorway, not moving, just watching the hall. She lifted a finger at me, the kind of small gesture that means, "Come here," without making noise. I walked over. She said, "Sit down a minute." I pulled the visitor's chair over from beside her bed and sat. She had pale gray eyes, very clear, and she looked at me a long time before she spoke. "Your nephew gets in tomorrow," she said. I said yes. "How did she know that?" She said, "Because your brother told a nurse last night when he was half out of himself. He said the boy was coming, and he was afraid of what the boy was going to do. He said it 3 times. He kept saying he should have changed the will. He kept saying it. The nurse just patted his hand and went on. But I heard him." I felt something cold move down my back. I asked her what she meant. She said, "I had a son once. He's why I'm in here alone. Whatever your nephew tells you when he gets here tomorrow, don't believe a word of it. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Don't agree to anything. Drive home tonight if you can. I mean it." I didn't know what to say to her. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her concern, and I went back to my brother's room and sat in the dark, and told myself she was a sad old woman who'd had a bad break with her own family and was projecting it onto mine. Cale was my nephew. I'd held him as a baby. I'd taught him to bait a hook on a lake in Idaho when he was 7 years old. The idea that he was coming down here to do something underhanded, it didn't even compute. I dismissed it. That was my first mistake. Cale showed up around 11 the next morning. He came through the door of the hospice room in a charcoal gray jacket, no tie, hair gone a little salt and pepper at the temples, and he hugged me before he even looked at his father. He smelled like aftershave and airport coffee. He said, "Uncle, I'm so sorry." I got here as fast as I could. He held me a beat longer than felt natural. I noticed that, and I dismissed that too. He sat by Hollis's bed for about 10 minutes and said all the right things. He held his father's hand. He talked low. Hollis was awake but barely tracking. At one point, Hollis turned his head and looked at me and not at Kala, and his eyes were wet, and he opened his mouth like he was going to say something to me, and then he closed it again. I'll never forget that. He looked at me. Then he closed his mouth. After about an hour, Cale said, "Uncle, can we step out and talk?" About the arrangements, about after. We went down to the cafeteria, just the 2 of us. He bought us both coffee. He sat across from me and laid his hands flat on the table like a man about to do business. He said, "Dad's been worrying about the house, the one in Coeur d'Alene. That was the cabin Hollis had built with his own 2 hands in the late 70s. On a piece of lakefront property he'd bought for almost nothing back then. It was worth, by my rough guess, somewhere north of $700,000 now. Hollis had lived in it alone since his wife Patricia passed in 2015. Cale said, "He wants me to handle the transfer. The thing is, Uncle, he's not going to make it through the week. Probably not the next 48 hours. The doctor told me this morning, and there's some paperwork that needs his signature while he's still lucid, otherwise it goes to probate, and the whole thing turns into a mess that takes 2 years and eats half the value in legal fees. You know how that goes?" I nodded slowly. I did know how that went. I'd watched a buddy of mine lose half his mother's estate to lawyers after she passed without proper documents in place. Cale said, "Dad asked me last week, before I flew out the first time, to draft up a quitclaim, just to keep things clean. He wants the cabin signed over to me directly so I can handle it after, sell it if I need to, take care of his final expenses, and what's left goes into the family. But he can barely hold a pen now. We're going to need a notary to come in this afternoon, and we're going to need a witness. That's where you come in." He looked at me with such a calm, clean, practical face, like he was talking about getting the oil changed. I said, "What about your sister?" "Cale has a sister. My niece Bryony. She lives in Oregon. has 2 kids, teaches at a community college. She and Cale have never been close. I hadn't seen her in 5 years. Cale said, Bryony's not in the will for the cabin. Dad and Mom set that up years ago. The house in Coeur d'Alene was always supposed to come to me. Bryony got the life insurance and the savings. It's all been worked out a long time. This is just paperwork. I said, I'd like to see what your father had drawn up before. And Cale smiled, just a little, just at the corner of his mouth, and he said, Uncle, of course, I have it in my bag upstairs. But honestly, I'd hate to put you through reading legal documents in the middle of all this. You're grieving. Let me handle it. You just sign as a witness this afternoon when the notary comes. That's when Mrs. Pemberley's voice came back to me. Don't sign anything. I said, I'd still like to see it. I'll come up to your hotel after dinner and we'll go through it together. His face shifted for a half-second. Just a half-second. The smile stayed, but his eyes did a thing, like a door closing somewhere behind them. Then he said, Sure, Uncle. Uncle, whatever makes you comfortable. I went back upstairs. Hollis was asleep. I sat there beside him for a long time, just looking at his face, and I thought about all the times he'd taken care of me. And I thought about the woman across the hall. And I thought about my nephew's face when I'd asked to see the paperwork. Around 4 that afternoon, a man in a brown suit showed up in the hallway carrying a leather briefcase and asked for Cale Hartwich, the notary. Cale came out of the room smiling, shook his hand, and the 2 of them walked into Hollis's room together. I stood up. I said, I want to be in there too. Cale said, Of course, Uncle. Come on in. We just need your signature too, as the witness. I walked into my brother's room. The notary had a stack of papers on a little folding tray over Hollis's bed. Hollis was awake, but his eyes were glassy, and he kept looking from me to Cale like he was trying to remember something. The notary was already explaining the documents in the bored voice of a man who's done this 1,000 times. I asked if I could see the papers. The notary handed me the top one. It was a quitclaim deed transferring the property in Coeur d'Alene to Cale Hartwich. That part was true, but underneath it was a second document, and underneath that, a third. The second was a power of attorney making Cale the sole agent over all of Hollis's financial affairs effective immediately. The third was an assignment of beneficiary on a life insurance policy I didn't even know my brother had. A $400,000 policy through his old union, with the beneficiary line freshly typed with Cale's name on it, replacing what looked like Bryony's name underneath in the carbon copy. I stood there holding those 3 documents, and I felt the room get very quiet. I said, Cale, what are these other 2? He said, Oh, those are just protective measures, in case Dad's situation changes and we need someone to handle his affairs in the next few days. I said, But your father's going to pass in a matter of days. The doctor told you that this morning. So why does he need a power of attorney? Cale said, Uncle, please, now isn't the time. I said, Why is the life insurance changed? Cale said, Bryony agreed to that. I said, Did she? Cale's face did the door-closing thing again. The notary, bless him, was looking back and forth between us like a man who was starting to think his afternoon had taken a turn. I told him I'd like a few minutes alone with my brother and my nephew. He nodded and stepped out into the hall. I closed the door behind him. I turned around and I looked at Cale, and I said very quietly, I want you to call your sister right now and put her on speakerphone. Cale said, Uncle, you're tired. You've been here too long. I said, Call her. He didn't move. I said, Then I'll call her. I took my phone out of my pocket and I scrolled to her number. I hadn't called her in years. It was still in there. She picked up on the second ring. I'd put her on speaker. I said, Bryony, it's Uncle Owen. I'm at the hospice with your father and your brother and a notary. Did you agree to be removed as the beneficiary on your father's life insurance policy through the Carpenters Union? There was a pause. Then she said, very slowly, I'm sorry, Uncle Owen, what? I said. Did you agree to it? She said, I don't know what you're talking about. What life insurance policy? Cale was already moving. He was already saying, "Bryony, hi, listen. This is just a misunderstanding. The documents are protective." She said, "Cale, what did you do?" He said, "Bryony, calm down." She said, "Uncle Owen, don't sign anything. I'll be on a flight tonight. Please don't sign anything. I'll be on a flight tonight." I hung up. The room was so quiet I could hear the oxygen concentrator clicking. I could hear Hollis breathing on the bed. Cale said, "Uncle, you don't understand the financial situation here. Dad owes money. He owes money to me. I've been paying for things for years. I deserve." I said, "Get out." He said, "Uncle," I said, "get out of this room." He stared at me. "And I want to tell you something. The boy I'd talked to Beta Hook in Idaho was not in that face. There was somebody else looking at me out of my nephew's eyes. Somebody calculating. Somebody who was already moving on to the next plan." He picked up his briefcase. He picked up the documents off the bed tray. He walked out without another word. I sat down on the edge of my brother's bed. I took his hand. He was looking at me. He was crying without making any sound, just tears running down into the pillow. I said, "It's all right, Hollis. It's all right." I stopped it. He squeezed my hand once. He passed away 31 hours later, on a Wednesday morning, just before sunrise. Bryony was there. I was there. Cale wasn't. The week after the funeral, Bryony and I sat down with my brother's actual lawyer in Coeur d'Alene, a woman named Marjorie Kestrel who'd handled Hollis's affairs for 20 years. She pulled up the real will. The cabin in Coeur d'Alene was supposed to be sold and split 50-50 between Cale and Bryony. The life insurance was Bryony's, all $400,000 of it. The savings, about $86,000, was to be divided 3 ways, with the last third going to a scholarship fund at the trade school where my brother had done his apprenticeship in 1972. The documents Cale had brought to that hospice room would have flipped almost every one of those provisions. The cabin would have been his outright. The life insurance would have been his, and with the power of attorney, in the 30 hours my brother had left, Cale could have drained the savings before the will was even read. Marjorie looked across her desk at me and she said, "You know what would have happened if you'd signed those papers." I said, "I do now." She said, "Where did you get the instinct to question it?" And I told her about Mrs. Pemberley. The woman across the hall, the one who'd grabbed me at 2 in the morning and told me to drive home tonight if I could, I drove back down to Boise the following Saturday to find her. I'd brought a little box of pastries from a bakery Bryony had recommended, and a card I'd written by hand. The nurse at the front desk recognized me and her face fell when I said who I was looking for. Mrs. Pemberley had passed on Thursday 2 days earlier. Quietly in her sleep, the nurse said. Her daughter hadn't come in to clear out the room yet. The nurse asked if I'd been close. I said no. I'd only met her once, really. But she'd done something for me I'd never be able to repay. The nurse was quiet. Then she said, "Did she give you a piece of paper?" I said no, she hadn't. The nurse said, "Wait here a minute." She came back with an envelope. My name was on the front, in shaky handwriting, Mr. Hartwich. The nurse said, "She left it at the front desk on Wednesday morning. Said if you came back, give it to you. If you didn't, throw it out." I took the envelope outside and sat on a bench in the cold November air and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was thin and slanted. It said, "Mr. Hartwitz, I don't know if you listened to me or not. I hope you did. My son's name was Tomlin. He took everything I had in the spring of 2009, the house, the savings, the rings my husband gave me. I never saw any of it again. He doesn't speak to me anymore because there's nothing left to take. The reason I'm telling you is because I have spent 15 years lying in beds like this one, in apartments smaller than this room, in places I never imagined I would end up. And the worst part is not the losing. The worst part is that nobody warned me. Not one person. I had a sister-in-law who knew what Tomlin was. She told me after, when I asked her, that she'd suspected for years. I asked her why she didn't say anything. She said it wasn't her place. That was the day I decided that if I ever again saw something happening to someone else, I would say something. It would be my place. So I said something to you. Whatever happened, I hope you are safe. Sincerely, Esther Pemberley. I sat on that bench for I don't know how long. It was cold and I didn't feel it. A nurse came out at one point and asked if I was all right, and I said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm all right. I'm just sitting here a little while." It wasn't her place, and she said something anyway. That's what saved me. That's what saved my brother's last wishes. That's what kept my niece from getting cheated out of $500,000 by her own brother in the worst week of her life. I drove home that night. 11 hours back to Tucson, and the whole way I kept thinking about my own life. About the things I'd seen in other people's families over the years, and not said anything about because it wasn't my place. About a buddy of mine whose grown daughter was clearly lying about what she was doing with the money he was sending her. About a neighbor whose son had moved back in and started helping with the bills, and then helping with the accounts. Things I'd noticed and chosen not to notice. Cale tried to call me twice in the next month. I didn't pick up. He sent a long email about misunderstandings and how I'd embarrassed him in front of a notary. He said our family was broken now, and it was my fault. He said his father would have wanted us to stay together. I read it once, and I deleted it. Bryony, on the other hand, Bryony I talk to almost every Sunday now. She's been good to me. She came down to Tucson for Easter and brought her 2 kids, and we went to the Desert Museum and ate green chewel cheeseburgers at a place I used to go with Marlo, and her oldest, who's 11, drew me a picture of a Roadrunner that's still on my refrigerator. About 6 months after my brother passed, I got a letter in the mail from a woman in Spokane I'd never heard of. Her name was at the top. A return address in a neighborhood I didn't know. The letter inside said her father had died in May and she'd been the executor. And going through his things, she'd found a notebook where he'd written down the names of people who defrauded him. One of those names was Cale Hartwich. Apparently Cale had borrowed $47,000 from her father, a man in his 80s, and never paid a dime back. She'd found my number through the obituary I'd helped Bryony write for Hollis. She wanted to know if there was a process for filing a claim against my brother's estate, and that's how she'd gotten my information. I called her back. We talked for an hour. Her name was Dolores. She was 68 years old, a widow, and her father had been the kind of man who never told his kids when he was being cheated because he was ashamed. She'd only found the notebook after he died. I called Bryony. Bryony called Marjorie. Marjorie looked into Cale's situation. By that fall, what we'd uncovered was that Cale had been doing this for years, not just to family, to clients, to his father's old friends, to anyone who'd let him near a checkbook. He had about $300,000 in unsecured debt, 2 pending civil suits in Washington state, and a gambling problem nobody in the family had known about. The cabin scheme at the hospice, we eventually realized, had been his last roll of the dice. If he'd gotten that property, he could have leveraged it the same week and stayed ahead of his creditors for another 6 months. He went to trial 19 months after my brother's death, not for what he tried to do at the hospice, exactly. That would have been hard to prove, and Bryony and I let it go, because we had everything that mattered. He went to trial for what he'd done to Dolores' father and to 2 other elderly clients in Spokane. He got 6 years. He's still inside as I'm telling you this. Bryony writes to him sometimes. I haven't. His son, my great-nephew, is named Brockton. He's 14 now. He lives with his mother, Cale's ex-wife, in Bellingham. I send him a card on his birthday every year and a check at Christmas, and his mother sends me a thank you note. I don't expect anything from that boy. He's not going to grow up calling me. But I want him to know somebody in his father's family thought about him kindly. About a year after the trial, Bryony and I started something small. We didn't call it a foundation or anything fancy. We started a thing through her church up in Oregon, and a similar little chapter through a senior center near me in Tucson. We just go in once a month and talk. We tell our story, We tell Esther Pemberley's story with her daughter's permission, and then we sit and we listen. The kinds of things people tell you when you sit and listen. I wish I could tell you it's rare what happened to me. It isn't. I've heard my own story with the names changed from probably 40 different people in the last 2 years. A son who needs just one signature. A grandson who's helping with the accounts. A daughter who knows just the right person to set up the trust. You only have to come into the office once. It happens every day. In every state. To people who balance their checkbooks every Sunday morning. I keep Esther's letter folded in the drawer of my nightstand. I take it out sometimes. I read it. I think about how easy it would have been for her to keep her mouth shut. She didn't owe me anything. She'd never met my brother. She was dying. She had every reason in the world to roll over in her bed and let me walk past her door. And she didn't. She stopped me at 2 a.m. in a dark hallway and she said the one thing I needed to hear, and 3 days later she was gone. That woman saved my brother's last wishes. That woman saved my niece's inheritance. That woman saved me from being the man who'd signed away his own brother's estate and spent the rest of his life trying to live with it. So I want to tell you, whoever you are listening to this, if you're seeing something in your family right now that doesn't look right, that's been gnawing at you, that you've been telling yourself is none of your business, it might be your business. It might be the only business that matters this week. The cost of saying something and being wrong is a little awkwardness. The cost of not saying something and being right is somebody's whole life. If somebody's pushing you to sign a paper today, this afternoon, before the notary leaves, before your mother wakes up, before your father passes, slow down. Take the paper home. Take a photograph of it. Call somebody who has nothing to gain. The people who love you will wait a day. The people who don't, won't. I'm 63 years old. I lost my wife. I lost my brother. I almost lost my brother's life's work in the last 48 hours of his life because I wanted to believe that the boy I'd taught to bait a hook was still that boy. He wasn't. Sometimes the people we love become people we don't recognize. And one of the hardest, kindest, most honest things we can do for ourselves and for the people we still have left is to look at what's actually in front of us instead of what we wish was there. I drive past the hospice in Boise sometimes when I'm up there visiting Bryony and the kids. It's still there. Still smells like lavender from the parking lot. Esther Pemberley's room faces the road. I look up at her window every time. I never knew her, really. We talked twice. She gave me one note, but she's family in a way some of my own blood never was. Family is who shows up. Family is who tells you the truth when telling the truth costs them nothing because they have nothing left to give. If this story meant anything to you, leave a comment below. Tell me about the person in your life who told you the truth when nobody else would. Tell me who your Esther was. And if you're going through something right now, I'm telling you the same thing she told me, and I'll say it as plain as I can. Don't sign it tonight. Drive home if you can. The truth will still be there in the morning, and so will the people who actually love you. Thank you for staying with me. Take care of yourselves out there, and listen to the strangers in the hallway. Sometimes they're the only ones telling you the truth. I've thought a lot, in the years since that night in the hospice hallway, about what kind of man I was before Esther Pemberley stopped me at 2 a.m. I was a man who balanced his checkbook every Sunday. I was careful with strangers and trusting with family, and I thought that was wisdom. It wasn't. It was the opposite. I had built my whole life on the assumption that the people who shared my blood would never be the people I needed to protect myself from, and the cost of that assumption almost came due in the last 48 hours of my brother's life. What I learned from Hollis lying in that bed, unable to speak, from Cale standing over him with 3 documents stacked in the wrong order, from Esther sitting in the dark waiting for someone to walk past her open door. What I learned is that every choice we make sets something in motion, and the choices we make about what we refuse to see set the loudest things in motion of all. Cale didn't become what he became overnight. He became it across decades of nobody in our family asking him hard questions, decades of his father sending him money and calling it generosity, Decades of me ruffling his hair at Christmas and not noticing the way he watched the room. Causes have effects, small kindnesses, when they're really avoidance, dressed up in better clothes, plant seeds you eventually have to harvest. The opposite is also true. Esther chose, alone in a hospice room with a body that was failing her, to spend her last energy on a stranger she'd seen exactly twice. That single act, that 1 minute of speaking up, kept my niece's inheritance whole. It kept my brother's last wishes intact. It kept me from being the man I would have had to be afterward. One choice. One night. The size of a thing has nothing to do with how far it travels. I think now that being a decent person isn't about loving the people you're supposed to love. Anyone can do that. It's about being honest enough to see them clearly, smart enough to ask the questions that hurt to ask, and tough enough to act on the answers when they come. That's the work. Honesty about what's in front of you. The mind to slow down when somebody's rushing you. The spine to say no to your own nephew with a notary 3 feet away. None of that is natural to most of us. It has to be practiced. So I'll leave you with what I tell myself most mornings now. The people who love you can wait an afternoon. The people who don't, won't. Whatever's gnawing at you in your own family right now, that quiet feeling that something doesn't add up, trust it. Look at it. Ask the question. The cost of being wrong is a little awkwardness. The cost of being right and saying nothing is somebody's whole life. And the strangest, hardest part of all of this is that the older I get, the more I believe the truest family I have are the people who told me hard things when nobody else would. Esther was one of them. I hope you have one too. And if you don't, I hope you can be one for somebody else.